February 10th, 1943. The Izhora River sector, south of Leningrad. The air is frozen at 25 degrees below zero. In the forward trenches near the ruined town of Krasny Bor, thousands of men are huddled against the biting wind. They wear the standard field grey greatcoats of the German Wehrmacht, but the voices drifting through the mist are speaking Castilian Spanish. These are the volunteers of the 250th Infantry Division, the Blue Division. On the horizon, 1,000 flashes light up the pre-dawn sky. Seconds later, the earth erupts. A massive artillery barrage from over 800 Soviet guns and dozens of Katyusha rocket batteries slams into the Spanish lines. Bunkers collapse instantly, burying men alive. Telephone lines are severed in the first minute, leaving the command posts blind. From the tree line, Soviet commanders lower their binoculars. This is the opening move of Operation Polar Star, a grand strategic offensive designed to finally lift the siege of Leningrad. They've amassed an overwhelming force to crush this single division of volunteers. They expect to walk over the corpses of the Spaniards, smash the German flank, and encircle the entire 18th Army. But when the smoke clears and the Soviet tanks grind forward, they find the survivors of the Blue Division, deafened, bleeding, and half frozen, digging themselves out of the rubble. And they are fixing bayonets. This was the Battle of Krasny Bor. It was the last great battle fought by a Spanish infantry formation in Europe, a day where a volunteer force faced the full weight of the Red Army and refused to break. To understand why 45,000 Spaniards ended up fighting and dying 3,000 kilometers from home, you have to understand the precarious position of Francisco Franco in 1941. Spain was a nation in ruins. The Spanish Civil War had ended only 2 years prior, leaving the country starving, economically shattered, and deeply divided. Franco had won that war, but he had done so with critical military aid from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The Condor Legion and Italian Corps had been instrumental in his victory, and now Adolf Hitler wanted a return on his investment. By 1940, Hitler controlled the continent. In the famous meeting at Hendaye in October 1940, Hitler pressured Franco to formally enter World War II on the side of the Axis. He wanted Spain to seize Gibraltar and close the Mediterranean to the British. But Franco knew Spain's military was exhausted and its economy was non-existent. Entering a global war would be suicide, but he also knew he couldn't simply say no to the man who had just conquered France in 6 weeks. He needed a way to pay his blood debt to Germany without dragging Spain into a formal war with the Allies. The solution appeared on June 22, 1941, when Germany launched the invasion of the Soviet Union. This changed the political calculus entirely. For the Franco regime, fighting the Western democracies was politically dangerous, but fighting communism was an ideological imperative. It allowed Franco to frame the conflict not as a war for German territorial expansion, but as a crusade against Bolshevism. Ramon Serrano Suñer, Franco's foreign minister and brother-in-law, addressed a massive crowd in Madrid, famously shouting, "Russia is guilty." He blamed the Soviet Union for prolonging the Spanish Civil War and for the deaths of thousands of Spaniards. He announced that Spain would send a division of volunteers to fight exclusively on the Eastern Front. Recruitment centers in Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, and Sevilla were flooded within hours. In Madrid alone, the recruitment quota was filled in a single day. The demographics of this first wave of volunteers were unique. The Corps was composed of hardcore phalangists, members of the Spanish Fascist Party who wore their blue uniform shirts with pride. For them, This was a continuation of the Civil War, a chance to strike at the heart of the ideology they hated. However, the ranks were also filled with university students, swept up in the religious and nationalist fervor of the moment. Entire classes enlisted together. There were also career army officers who resigned their commissions in the regular Spanish army just to enlist as privates in this new volunteer force, eager for combat experience and German decorations. But beneath the propaganda reels, there was a more complex reality. A significant minority of the volunteers were former Republicans, men who had fought against Franco. They were the losers of the Civil War, men with red backgrounds. They enlisted for pragmatic, often desperate reasons. Some hoped that by shedding blood for the regime, they could clear their names and secure jobs in the new Spain. Others joined to get their fathers or brothers out of Franco's prisons. For many, the simple promise of a German soldier's salary was the only way to feed their starving families back home. This mix of fanatics, adventurers, and desperate men was organized into 4 infantry regiments. They were officially named the División Española de Voluntarios, but because the Phalangists insisted on wearing their blue party shirts under their tunics, the unit earned the name that history remembers, the Blue Division. In July 1941, the volunteers boarded trains for the Third Reich. They arrived at the massive military training grounds in Grafenwöhr, Bavaria. Here, the Spanish identity had to be submerged into the German war machine. They were issued standard Wehrmacht equipment: the field grey uniform, the Mauser Kar-98K rifle, and the iconic Stahlhelm helmet. The only concession to their nationality was a shield on the right sleeve bearing the Spanish colours of red and gold and the word España. They were designated the 250th Infantry Division of the German Army. But the cultural clash between the rigid, disciplined German instructors and the relaxed, often unruly Spaniards was immediate. The Germans were appalled by the Spaniards' lack of drill discipline, their loud demeanor, and their casual attitude toward uniform regulations. German reports from this period often described the division as a band of gypsies or an undisciplined rabble that would likely break under fire. Despite this, in late August, the division was deployed to the Eastern Front, but the German logistical system was already beginning to buckle under the strain of the invasion. There were no trains available to take them to the front lines, so instead, they walked. They marched from Suwałki in Poland to Vitebsk in Belarus, a distance of nearly 1,000 kilometers. For 40 days, they marched through the autumn rains that turned the roads into rivers of mud. It was a brutal initiation that hardened the soldiers into a cohesive unit before they ever saw a Soviet soldier. In October 1941, the division was finally deployed for combat. They were sent to the Volkhov front, north of Lake Ilmen, near the ancient city of Novgorod. Here, the Spaniards were introduced to the reality of the Russian winter. And this was one of the coldest winters in recorded history. Temperatures routinely dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The combat on the Volkhov front was savage, a dirty, static war of attrition fought in frozen forests and swamps. The Spaniards lived in isbas, traditional Russian log cabins infested with lice and rats. Despite the conditions, the Blue Division quickly proved its German critics wrong. They developed a reputation for aggressive patrolling and stubborn defense. One specific incident cemented their reputation. In January 1942, a Spanish ski company, roughly 200 men, was ordered to cross the frozen surface of Lake Ilmen to relieve a surrounded German garrison. They marched straight into a blizzard with temperatures nearing negative 50 degrees. Of the 206 men who started the mission, only 12 survived without frostbite or injury. But they crossed the lake, engaged the Soviets, and relieved the German position. This suicidal bravery earned the division the Iron Cross and the begrudging respect of the German High Command. By August 1942, the Blue Division had suffered thousands of casualties, but it remained a cohesive fighting force. The German High Command decided to move them to a more critical sector, the siege of Leningrad. The division was redeployed to the northern flank, taking up positions in the suburbs of Leningrad. The Spaniards dug in, creating a sophisticated network of trenches, bunkers, and strongpoints. They held a sector of roughly 30 kilometers. In January 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Iskra, punching a narrow land corridor through to Leningrad and breaking the absolute blockade. But it wasn't enough. Stalin wanted the siege lifted completely. He wanted the German 18th Army encircled and destroyed. The plan was Operation Polar Star. It was a massive pincer movement. The 55th Soviet Army would smash through the German lines south of Leningrad while another force attacked from the east. If they linked up, the German army would be trapped. The Soviet planners saw that the key to the entire operation was the Moscow-Leningrad highway and the strategic railway line at Tosno. Blocking that route was the village of Krasny Bor, and holding Krasny Bor was the Spanish Blue Division. The Soviet assessments marked the Spanish sector as the weak link. They assumed the volunteers were demoralized and poorly equipped. Soviet General Vladimir Sviridov massed 4 elite rifle divisions, 2 tank regiments with heavy KV-1 armor, and ski brigades for the breakthrough. It was 44,000 Soviet troops against 5,600 Spaniards, 100 tanks against 0. On the night of February 9th, the Spanish sentries reported the sound of heavy engines and tank treads clattering in the darkness. General Emilio Esteban Infantes, the Spanish division commander, ordered his men to take their posts. They checked their ammunition, wrote final letters home, and waited for the sun to rise on what would be the bloodiest day in the history of the unit. The artillery bombardment that began at 6:45 a.m. was one of the heaviest concentrated barrages of the entire Eastern Front. For 2 solid hours, the Soviets poured high explosives onto the Spanish lines at a rate of thousands of shells per hour. At 8:45 a.m., the shelling finally lifted. Soviet commanders believed nothing could have survived that storm. General Sviridov gave the order to advance, and the Soviet attack began with a massive armored thrust. Following close behind were the waves of ski troops and infantry. They moved confidently across the open ground, heading straight for the smoking ruins of Krasny Bor. But as the first wave of Soviet tanks crested the ruined Spanish trenches, the snow erupted with gunfire. The survivors of the 262nd Regiment were still there. They had crawled out of their collapsed dugouts and manned their machine guns. They waited until the Soviet infantry was in the kill zone and then opened fire. Soviet doctrine stipulated that infantry ride on the backs of tanks or follow closely behind to protect the armor. But the Spanish infantry, lacking heavy anti-tank weapons, made a calculated, almost suicidal decision. They let the Soviet tanks pass right over their foxholes, and once the tanks had rumbled past, the Spaniards popped up from the snow and engaged the Soviet infantry who were following behind. This created a deadly separation. The Soviet tanks found themselves deep behind the Spanish lines, unsupported and blind. Meanwhile, the Soviet infantry was pinned down in the forward trenches, locked in savage hand-to-hand combat with the Spanish survivors. Without infantry support, the Soviet tanks became vulnerable. Spanish soldiers, possessing almost no anti-tank guns capable of penetrating a KV-1, resorted to using Molotov cocktails and magnetic mines. Groups of men would rush a moving tank, climbing onto the engine deck to smash a bottle of gasoline over the vents or jam a grenade into the treads. The battlefield devolved into hundreds of isolated, desperate duels. There was no front line anymore. It was a confused melee of burning tanks and trench brawls. While the forward lines held on, the main weight of the Soviet offensive slammed into the key strategic points of the sector. The battle focused on 3 critical locations. The first was the October Railway, where an embankment was the high ground. A single company of Spaniards held the station. They were hit by wave after wave of Soviet infantry, and by noon, they were completely surrounded. The fighting here was brutal. Of the nearly 200 men who started the defense, only 40 were left standing when the sun went down. They held the station until they were physically overrun. On the left flank, the defense centered around an old stone building known as El Molino, the paper mill. It commanded the approaches to the Izhora River. A mixed group of Spanish sappers and infantry turned the mill into a fortress. The Soviets pounded the building with direct fire from their tanks, and the walls were breached, the roof collapsed, and the building caught fire. Yet, the Spaniards continued to fire from the basement ruins and the rubble piles. Every time the Soviet infantry tried to storm the ruins, they were thrown back by grenades and submachine gun fire. The defenders of the paper mill bought the German command precious hours to organize a counterattack. In the town of Krasny Bor itself, the fighting was house to house. The Spanish headquarters staff, clerks, cooks, and medics grabbed rifles and joined the line. The Luftwaffe launched desperation airstrikes, strafing the Soviet columns on the open road, but the Spanish were largely fighting alone. By late afternoon, the Soviet advance had stalled. They'd taken the ruins of the town, but they'd failed to break out into the open country. By the evening of February 10th, the momentum of the Soviet offensive was broken. The German 18th Army had managed to rush reserves to plug the gaps in the line. The sun sets over a landscape of utter devastation. Burning T-34s littered the fields, and the snow was stained black and red. The cost of stopping the Red Army was staggering. In a single day, the Blue Division had 1,125 men confirmed dead. Another 1,036 were missing, most of them buried in the collapsed bunkers or taken prisoner, and over 1,000 were wounded. The 262nd Regiment had ceased to exist as a combat unit. They had lost 75% of their officers and men. But the toll they exacted on the Soviets was even higher. The 55th Army had lost an estimated 11,000 to 14,000 men. The 63rd Guards Rifle Division, an elite unit mind you, was decimated. Over 50 Soviet tanks lay burning or disabled in the Spanish sector. Operation Polar Star relied on a quick breakthrough to encircle the German army. Because the Spanish volunteers held the shoulder of the breakthrough for 24 hours, the Soviet pincer never closed. The siege of Leningrad would continue, but the German front didn't collapse. The German High Command, which had once mocked the Gypsy Division, was forced to issue a formal commendation. The Chief of Staff of the Army Group North wrote simply, "The Spaniards have not yielded an inch of ground. One cannot imagine more fearless fellows." By the autumn of 1943, the German army had been crushed at Kursk and the Allies had landed in Italy. The Americans were exerting massive diplomatic pressure on Francisco Franco, threatening to cut off Spain's oil supply if he didn't sever ties with the Axis. Franco, ever the pragmatist, realized the wind had shifted. The crusade against Bolshevism was now a liability, and on October 10th, 1943, the order came down from Madrid. The Blue Division was to be disbanded and repatriated immediately. Trains began ferrying thousands of men back to the Spanish border. But for a hardcore minority, the war wasn't yet over. Nearly 3,000 men refused to leave. Some were fanatical anti-communists who believed the fight was still winnable. Others were now exiles who felt they had no place in a neutral Spain. To accommodate them, a compromise was struck. The Spanish government authorized the creation of a smaller, private unit, the Blue Legion, or Legión Azul. Those that remained behind were attached to the German 121st Infantry Division and thrown immediately back into the line on the Narva front in Estonia. They fought a desperate, retreating action throughout the terrible winter of 1943 to 44. By March 1944, even this was too much political risk for Franco. He ordered the Legion to return, but even then, some refused to go. Roughly a few hundred Spaniards joined the Waffen-SS. They were integrated into the Walloon Division and other foreign volunteer units. Under the command of Miguel Esguerra, a former Blue Division officer, these men fought all the way back to the heart of the Third Reich. In April 1945, during the Battle of Berlin, the unit Esguerra was reported fighting in the ruins of the government district. These Spanish diehards were among the last defenders of the Reich Chancellery and Hitler's bunker. They fought in the burning streets of Berlin until they were either killed or captured by the Soviets. At Krasny Bor and in the battles that followed, the Soviets were able to capture roughly 300 Spanish soldiers. Stalin, however, didn't view these men as prisoners of war. To the Soviet Union, they were fascist mercenaries fighting for a neutral country. They were stripped of their ranks, denied any sort of protections, and sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. They were moved between camps like Cherepovets and Karaganda, enduring starvation, disease, and brutal forced labor in the mines. The Soviet NKVD targeted them for re-education, trying to force them to renounce Franco and embrace communism. The prisoners responded with defiance. Their resistance was organized by Captain Teodoro Palacios, who became the ranking officer in the camps. He maintained strict military discipline among the prisoners, and when the Soviets tried to force them to work on Spanish national holidays, the Spaniards went on hunger strikes. Further, they would sabotage equipment and refuse to sing communist anthems. Palacios became known as the ambassador in hell. He kept the men united, reminding them that they were still soldiers of Spain, even in rags behind barbed wire. Back home, their families held funeral masses, believing they were long dead. The years dragged on. 1945 became 1950, and then Stalin died in 1953. Finally, in the diplomatic thaw that followed Stalin's death, negotiations opened. The Red Cross managed to secure the release of the surviving Spaniards. On April 2nd, 1954, 11 years after the Battle of Krasny Bor, a Greek merchant ship named Semiramis docked in the port of Barcelona. A massive crowd waited on the pier. 248 men walked off. They were skeletal, aged beyond their years, and dressed in ill-fitting civilian clothes. But they didn't walk off as a mob. They marched off in formation, following Captain Palacios. The return of the soldiers was a final emotional closure to the war. Today, the legacy of the Blue Division is one of the most complex and uncomfortable topics in modern Spanish history. For decades, under the Franco dictatorship, they were mythologized as crusaders who saved Christian civilization. But after Spain transitioned to democracy in the 1970s, the pendulum swung. The Blue Division became an embarrassing reminder of Spain's collaboration with Nazi Germany. Modern historians now occupy a middle ground. They acknowledge the uncomfortable truth. Militarily, the Blue Division was elite. At Krasny Bor, a division of volunteers held off an entire Soviet army, performing a feat of defensive warfare that few units in World War II could match. They proved their worth as soldiers. But politically, their legacy is stained. They fought bravely, but they fought for a regime that didn't care about them. They were pawns in a dictator's game of survival, who traded oil and political favor, then largely forgot them when they became inconvenient. But regardless, they were the Blue Division, and whether history views them as heroes or villains, one fact remains. On the frozen plains of Russia, they stood their ground. But what do you think? Do you think the Blue Division proved their worth, or was this a wasted sacrifice? Had you ever heard of the Battle of Krasny Bor before this video? Were you aware that over 45,000 Spaniards fought on the Eastern Front? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.